And welcome back to Powers to the People. Little Chambers Brothers kicking off the final 15 here, and time has come today. And joining us on the phone this afternoon, guest Richard Lynn, who is an analyst with the Department of Homeland Security. A very smart guy, and one of our listeners actually chimed in and said, hey, this guy sounds really smart, but kind of like a fun guy to hang out with. Richard, welcome back to the program.
I have people fooled then.
All right, Richard. Well, I wanted to get back to this whole idea of the military-industrial complex and what's going on there. You know, isn't there a kind of, and this is what Eisenhower, I think, was warning about, when you create this huge military-industrial complex, as we have here in the United States, you have, of course, the lobbyists for that complex, the people who create these weapon systems, and the people who actually it is to their benefit for the United States to go to war. You build
the Iron Triangle.
Yeah, you build all these things, and you got all these toys, and that are supposed to blow up and maim and destroy. Well, there becomes, I think, don't you have maybe the inclination that, hey, we ought to use some of this stuff? Maybe there's a little bit of an idea that, well, we've got all of this weaponry. Don't you think that maybe we might be inclined to use it quicker?
Well, you know, first I want to talk about the whole Eisenhower speech, the farewell address he gave about the military-industrial complex. Of course, it's one of the most celebrated farewell addresses in American history. The problem is that oftentimes it's taken out of context. And yes, you're right. There was a sense, as we had talked about earlier, that America was departing from kind of like an anti-standing army ideology, and that was a radical break. And Eisenhower was warning about that. He was talking about his fear that America was changing fundamentally. But what people don't talk about is that he felt it was necessary. He felt that the United States had an obligation as the leader of the free world to build its military up so it could defend its allies, maintain its commitments, and of course deter any threats, which, you know, with a strong army you could have a greater likelihood of maintaining the peace. So it is true that Eisenhower warned about that, but never was that a warning in the sense that the United States shouldn't spend, because quite frankly, without spending, it increased the likelihood of confrontation, and it would have emboldened the Soviet Union to continue their expansion.
Well, you know, it just seems to me that the inclination, and we see it now, we see our military, and we see adventurism in countries like Libya. We see the United States, using its power in Iraq and Afghanistan now. Of course, Afghanistan, as we said before, the graveyard of empires, and it seems like we're beginning to see that happen to our empire a little bit.
Right.
The United States stretching itself pretty thin. We've got troops all over Europe. We've got troops in South Korea. We've got troops spread out in bases all over the world, and of course our military complex costs a lot of money to maintain, and now we're going through these deficit reduction talks, and of course if they don't come up with some sort of solution, there's going to be some draconian cuts in military as far as our Defense Department is concerned, also draconian cuts in our entitlement programs.
Trigger cuts.
Yeah, they put in these triggers. Now, it just seems to me that, you know, maybe, and I am a bit of a libertarian, and I lean a little bit towards Ron Paul's ideas on, especially on foreign policy, that the United States really doesn't have any business being an adventurous type country. We should start taking care of ourselves a little bit more. I'm not an isolationist, and I don't feel like Ron Paul that maybe Iran should be allowed to get nuclear weapons, but I do feel that maybe we're stretching ourselves a little bit too thin. You know, maybe it's time for us to, you know, stop nation building in other countries and get back to nation building here in the United States.
Right. Well, I think that you have two different currents, obviously, throughout American history. You've always had one side of America looking to, expand its values into the world. And you even get that, say, during the French Revolution in the early part of American history, when you had Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, supporting the French Revolution and saying we should basically help export our revolution around the world. Then and you had that all throughout American history, and you had people like John Quincy Adams saying we don't search for monsters around in the world. I think a lot of people looked at the founders for wisdom, and at the time the founders did support neutrality. They supported the idea of American independence, American sovereignty, and they supported the idea that essentially the primary goal of American foreign policy should be American interests. But at the same time, I think what they wanted to do with America was to build it up so that it could get to the point to make decisions, to make the proper decisions for its own interest. And so there are times when we are going to intervene, and we're going to have to intervene because that's the world we live in. But there are times when we need to be wise when to intervene, because obviously the United States does not have unlimited resources. We probably we absolutely have the most resources when it comes to military projection. No other country in the world can send an entire army across the world and a bunch of military, aircraft carriers or even our intelligence units. No one has that kind of force projection the way the United States has. And so when there are problems in the world, I think it's a matter of being wise as far as when is the proper time to intervene, when is this a good use of our resources, of course, is this consistent with our values. So I think that the great lesson to take, especially from the founders in this, is that they were never all non-interventionalists. They were never all pro-interventionalists, but they were about a wise country, an independent country that conducted itself in a way consistent with our values and consistent with our interests, that our interests remain first.
Well, and we've seen our country now, especially in recent years, and since this president, to be quite frank, came into office, we see the respect that the world has for the United States in decline, especially when in terms of our military. We saw the president pull our missile defense system out of Georgia because Russia threatened there. We've seen, and those are, I think, places where it would be wise to have our military. I mean, I do believe that, and we see our missile defense system basically being tossed out by this administration. Something that if we're going to spend money on anything, certainly it should be on defending our country. And so I see us with these adventures in places like Libya, where we're helping a bunch of rebels that we really don't know who they are, and yet we're retreating from defending our allies in Israel. We're beginning to show weakness as far as our allies in Great Britain, and of course our allies in Georgia and in that region. Have we moved away from the kind of foreign policy that we should have, and to one that's maybe adventurous in some areas and not strong enough in the areas that really count?
Yeah, that actually does bring up an interesting point, because you've had presidents. I think this whole idea of adventurism has been something that really has been longer than it goes back in our history farther than people have thought. I mean, the idea essentially. I mean, the Democratic Party going back to the 20th century, going back to when America became a world power. I think oftentimes have had a more idealistic view of American foreign policy. If you read President Kennedy's first inaugural address, some have equated it to a declaration of war against the Soviet Union. That might be a little dramatic way to put it, but essentially he was challenging the Soviet Union. He said that we were, quote unquote, would pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. And he wasn't talking just about domestically. He was talking foreign policy-wise. He was thinking of Castro and the communists in Cuba and Laos and all around the world, and the Soviets in Berlin. I think what's interesting, and if you want to talk about the contrast between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the Democratic Party has prided itself on the idea of diplomacy and international organizations and as a means to promoting American interests and world peace. But obviously conservatives, Republicans have, men like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan have seen as more hawkish and anti-communist or very pro-American. If you've ever read the book Reagan and Gorbachev by Jack Matlock, he talks about how the Soviet Union during the Cold War actually preferred they preferred Republicans over Democrats. And, people, supposedly the Democrats claim to have the better foreign policy, more diplomacy. That actually doesn't really show up in the historical record. You have Democrats. I think what happened was that the Soviets understood that the Democrats were the people that told you what you wanted to hear. The Republicans were the people that you knew exactly where they stood. You knew that, you knew President Reagan did not like the communist system. And you knew that when you were negotiating with him, he was being upfront with you. And I think if you actually look at the people, at the presidents who had foreign policies that were more successful, Richard Nixon, even though he was criticized for Watergate, and there are a lot of things to criticize him about, most people believe he was one of our most brilliant foreign policy presidents. Republican, President Reagan, Republican. And you look, say, at Democratic foreign policy, who remembers Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy? Jimmy Carter, disastrous.
Actually, Johnson...
And if anything, he just coasted.
Yeah, and Johnson basically had to resign because of his foreign policy. Richard, we've run out of time. We've run out of day. We've run out of program. But gosh, it's been a pleasure having you on today, and we'd like to have you back as our foreign policy expert anytime you're available. Okay?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I always love talking to you guys.
All right, well, appreciate it. And how can people find you online?
Well, I can give my email and, and of course the website, which is www.firstinpeace.com. As far as my email, it's rm as in Michael, lim as in Michael, 83@gmail.com.
All right. And firstinpeace.com is your website, right?
Yes.
All right,
yes.
Richard, as always, a pleasure having you on the program this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and we will have him back on. Trust me, he is a very intelligent guy and always fun to talk to. That does it for today's program. Thank you, Demetrius, for lining up such great guests. We want to thank Star Parker for being on today, and thank you all for listening.
And thank you for the opportunity to be a part.
All right, we'll be back tomorrow. Same time, same station. Get back.
You're listening to Talk Radio 1380 WNRR AM North Augusta, where news radio rocks. And streaming live at WNRR1380.com.